Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for the latest Policy Solutions webinar, where we will explore new findings in private sector and civil society responses to technology-facilitated gender-based violence, or TFGBV. My name is Adam Perkins-Goldstein. I am a program officer for applied research here at the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE, on the Policy and Program Learning team. First, a bit about CIPE. CIPE is a global organization working to strengthen democracy in markets and one of the core institutes of the National Endowment for Democracy. At CIPE, the Policy and Program Learning Team, or PPL, pursues answers to crucial questions about the direction of democratic market systems, highlighting areas for business leadership and reform. PPL's Policy Solutions series synthesizes new research findings that intersect with our core areas of practice and existing expertise to produce strategic recommendations for our partner network and programs. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Ipshita Ghosh, author of a forthcoming publication on private sector and civil society responses to TFGBV. The report, part of CIPE's Policy Solutions series, is titled Combating Technology-Facilitated Gender-Based Violence in Developing Nations and Emerging Markets. Dr. Ghosh's paper provides new policy and strategy recommendations based on a comparative analysis of anti-TFGBV in 5 different countries: Mexico, Sri Lanka, Uganda, Paraguay, and India. Dr. Ghosh joined CIPE Center for Women's Economic Empowerment Deputy Director Connie Gonzalez and Center for Digital Economy and Governance Program Manager Adam Sachs. With considerable experience incorporating inclusion and emerging technologies into CIPE's programs, Connie and Adam will offer unique perspectives on TFGBV. We hope that the audience today will use these recommendations to inspire new thinking and strategies to foster private sector and civil society-based strategies. Thank you, and without further delay, I'll hand it off to Dr. Ghosh to share her research.
Thank you so much, Adam. I'll start by sharing my slides. So I'll start by giving a kind of a brief background to this research, which actually started pretty much about a year ago in August of last year. The main question that was presented for me to explore in this research was to look at this concept of technology-facilitated gender-based violence, trying to understand what constitutes this concept of TFGBV, what types of behaviors are entailed within this concept, as well as what are some of the models that are emerging to combat it, to mitigate TFGBV. And to what extent these models can be replicated elsewhere. And all these questions were really within the context of emerging markets, developing nations, transition democracies. So that added sort of a geographical and sociocultural context to this. And I'm glad to be able to share some of my findings with you today. So the outline I have for today is just kind of going over how I approach defining TFGBV, what were some of the case studies that we looked at in this paper, some of the overall trends and solutions in terms of the major findings from these case studies, and finally, what this tells us about recommendations and best practices for how the private sector can be involved in combating TFGBV. So especially in the context of emerging markets and developing nations, we see there's a lack of consistent definition as far as TFGBV is concerned. There are definitions employed by key international development agencies, but something we found is that there's often little on-the-ground resonance for these types of terms. So what that means is that literally these terms may not be popular in some of these contexts, but also the types of behaviors included under TFGBV quite broadly by UN Women, IECRW, etc. A lot of those behaviors may not be given as much significance in various contexts. So certain types of behaviors may be considered more problematic than others. So this was definitely an interesting finding for us. What actually constitutes TFGBV to different different folks. And in that context, these definitions that international development agencies use, they're effective starting points, but really they need to be informed by the local context that we're dealing with here. So for the context of this paper, we're really thinking of TFGBV as acts committed online or with the help of digital and communication technologies. They are significantly detrimental to physical, psychological, sexual, emotional, economic well-being of the victims, who are primarily women, primarily gender minorities. They are carried out with digital technologies, which are of relevance to both gender and IT stakeholders. And very crucially, the impacts of TFGBV continue online. So women who are survivors of TFGBV often continue to face repercussions offline in the real world as well. Something I do want to highlight is that we are looking at these phenomena in the context of emerging markets, developing nations, transition democracies, and that brings with it a range of challenges of its own. So for example, I have this case here in January of 2024. There were two Serbian journalists who were perceived to have made a derogatory comment on a video which was playing a nationalist song. And so they began to face this whole barrage of insults and harassment online. One of their phone numbers was also leaked on social media. And so she started receiving hate calls and messages. And all of this led to her, in fact, quitting Twitter and quitting social media. And this really resonates with experiences of women journalists, women politicians, and in various parts of the world. And they have what the National Democratic Institute has called a chilling effect on their speech, on discussions around especially social and political topics. So when it comes to TFGBV, a lot of, as we said, a lot of women are at risk here, but particularly women with intersecting marginal identities, LGBTQ plus women, racial minorities. We just talked about the experience of a woman journalist, so women in politics and public-facing professions, women's rights activists. And we also found girls and young women also face a disproportionate risk of TFGBV. So in terms of the case studies that we looked at in this paper, I'll just spend a moment mentioning what was the rationale for selecting these particular examples. As with this particular, the way we are approaching this study, all of these examples are from emerging markets. And they really refer to a range of modalities of mitigating TFGBV. So we have legislative, technological, social movements as well. So we're really trying to cover a range of types of action. What I was also interested in is trying to investigate whether there is a certain level of replicability, whether there are lessons we can learn from these and apply them to other contexts. And finally, in many or most of these, there is a significant role of the private sector. And in all of these, the private sector has lessons to learn and maybe use and develop their own models of mitigation. Okay, so the first study we have here is Olympia's Law from Mexico. Now, this is an example that is coming out of the direct experience that Olympia Melo faced, where she was a survivor of TFGBV herself, where her intimate photos were leaked without her consent, and she faced a whole range of consequences for that. She tried to pursue legal action and realized that there is very little pathway for her to seek justice under the existing laws back when she was going through this. So she's really started a social movement as a founder of Digital Defenders, and it brought together women's groups and feminist activists. And all of this culminated in the passing of the Olympia's law in Mexico in 2021, which criminalizes the non-consensual sharing of intimate content digitally. And this kind of became a model law that is being used as a template for similar legislative action in other parts of Latin America as well. This particular example was really interesting because it points to shared challenges that TFGBV victims and survivors face in seeking justice and seeking legal action. It's also really inspiring and interesting to note the way in which the social movement was built and how that managed to push forward a legislative agenda. The role of the private sector here was really interesting because it started with workers and women employees of private sector who joined this movement in large numbers, attending protests, playing leadership and advisory roles within the movement, generating feedback, which helped in drafting the law. And so in those ways, we see how the movement was able to bring together several strands of society and create a coherent vision for a legislative action, which then went on to be passed in Mexico. The second example that I studied was Delete Nothing from Sri Lanka. Now, this is an interesting technological example because it's a survey tool that helps to create confidential reports on TFGBV. And it enables survivors essentially to take charge and tell their story on their terms. This is an open source tool, and something like this can really be an inspiration that can help other organizations, including private sector organizations, to establish similar platforms for enabling survivors to tell their story in a confidential manner and retain control over it. And the data that's gathered through this tool is also used to leverage social media companies to take steps to combat TFGBV. And so we see at the end, one of the important finding here pertains to data. And in that sense, the Delete Nothing example is really interesting. We also looked into the example of VUGNet in Uganda, which is an advocacy group that works through coalition building with a focus on gender and technology. It works with private sector through the corporate social responsibility networks of telecom companies and internet providers in building awareness and equipping women with ICT skills. One of the most interesting learnings coming out of this case is the fact that VUGNet is, of course, operating in a context where there are civil liberties are quite constrained. And so the strategies that are used in terms of framing and partnership is really interesting here. So, for example, a lot of the work that's done considers men to be a major beneficiary of VUGNet's work and VUGNet's advocacy. Moreover, the way they frame a lot of their work, it is really kind of centering the challenge of TFGBV, gender, and digital education in terms of something that's a strategic concern for Uganda as a whole, for Ugandan society as a whole. So to be able to then create that framing and then establish a really multi-sectoral coalition is a really effective and replicable strategy. I also studied TDIG in Paraguay, which is, again, a nonprofit that runs digital campaigns working with fashion companies, doing a lot of social media art and graphic design, for example, to mainstream TFGBV-related discussions. And we see an example of the kind of sort of pretty striking artwork that they have used. TTIC has been really effective at working with media. They have worked with a range of companies and influencers to talk about their work and to also mainstream TFGBV action. At the same time, TDIC has been a part of a regional coalition for Latin America, and it participates with other nonprofits and organizations to develop communication campaigns to support TFGBV survivors. The last example I studied in this research was Shiro's, which is coming out of India. And this is an interesting example for the private sector. First of all, Shiro's is itself a tech startup, and it's sort of this all women's social media space. It creates a space to support women entrepreneurs. It supports the economic sovereignty of women through business and personal development courses, workshops, providing access to financial and personal development counseling. And it also works in sync with other private companies and technology firms to support, again, women's sovereignty, support women's journeys in becoming entrepreneurs, and in combating digital violence. So we see some of the types of companies it has worked here, including Google and Dell, in helping women take that journey to becoming entrepreneurs. So through through a range of these case studies, we see that while digital technologies offer many economic opportunities for women, they're also creating space for abuse, for a range of predatory behaviors. And something that really stood out to me during this research was that a lot of this is very new for policymakers, and they are not fully understood. And therefore, combating them is challenging. So legislative solutions are often absent in many of these contexts, or even when they are there in a very basic form, they are quite insufficient or ineffective. Another challenge we face here related to the first point is a lack of data about the types of behaviors and the ways they occur, particularly in emerging markets. So building this data is a key first step. Something that a lot of these examples we've looked at here have done so well is collaboration and building multi-sector coalitions involving the private sector and civil society and creating effective framing mechanisms. And that has been crucial in mainstreaming TFGBV, in scaling impactful solutions, and overall strengthening women's economic sovereignty. And we see here some of the ways in which this collaboration is taking place. So there are so many other ways this might happen and continue, but some of them include awareness campaigns involving social media influencers, technology companies. We are seeing that women-led businesses, also digital startups and businesses, often you might have a higher buy-in with those kinds of companies if you're trying to start some kind of partnership there. Supporting technological tools and promoting them among business associations, chambers of commerce. In that context, leveraging CSR to enhance capacity building for civil society might also be a really key step. And overall strengthening education and training in the safe and ethical use of ICTs. This is a broader structural transformation that needs to happen for all the other aspects of legislative, social, cultural change that we are trying to create. Finally, what are some of the best practices that the private sector can keep in mind? So through a lot of these examples, we are seeing that developing clear workplace policy on TFGBV is important. And again, for that, we need a sophisticated understanding of what this is and how it can occur. But a policy like this needs to be based on transparency, accessibility, and accountability. It needs to help survivors to tell their story by creating confidential platforms. And also these platforms need to take data protection seriously. TFGBV survivors need to trust these platforms. We also see examples where physical or virtual spaces for women within the organizational or firm structure can be really important, can be really interesting also in terms of helping women voice these concerns, as well as having opportunities for mentorship and leadership on TFGBV-related concerns. These partnerships, as and when they do occur, can be developed in a way which have very specific measurable goals. And we see some of that happening already with some of these examples where, for example, CSR is leveraged to support emerging technologies or with a very particular goal in mind to pursue to kind of force private sector companies to pursue certain actions that will be beneficial for these civil society companies who are creating this awareness or advocacy. I want to just wrap up my findings here and just also say a big thank you to all the consultants and interlocutors who were a part of this research. And I will stop sharing my slides and give it back to you, Adam.
Thank you, Ipshita, for the great presentation. I now want to give Connie and Adam a chance to add some additional layers of detail to this research. So I do have a question for both Connie and Adam. The research tells us that TFGBV is both a technology and a gender problem, but I want to understand the different component parts. So I'll ask Adam first. Can you kind of discuss how advocates have approached this topic as a technology problem?
Sure, and thank you, Adam, for the question and really for organizing today's discussion on this important topic. I mean, TFGBV undermines women's economic and digital inclusion and women's role in society. I think the presentation touched on a lot of valuable approaches that advocates can really work on this issue. I think at the heart of several of our projects is education, and this can be in the digital form of e-learning. Through our digital literacy training curriculum, we help businesses transition their businesses online. But many women transition their businesses online without any safeguards or support to address online risks or harms. And so one of our 4 modules of that course focuses on digital security. By increasing understanding of the problem and identifying successful protections at the enterprise level, we can really empower businesswomen to take action and to really protect themselves online and to develop strategies to counter TFGBV. That is really that first line of defense. I also think this early awareness raising is important. Research, knowledge transfer is instrumental, and technology can really facilitate that to really reach out and broaden the scope of actors. This can come in the form of developing case studies that we saw today to really understand the extent of TFGBV and then the consequences. I think the work that in Colombia, Cambodia, and Kosovo that CIPE has really done really kind of reflects that this issue transcends regions and cultural contexts, and that is really misunderstood. So research is really important there. Developing digital tools and platforms to help us understand how to combat this. This isn't the job of just big tech, but also individual actors are also empowered to make that sort of change and really kind of make the change that reflects what their local context looks like. I'll also mention a key component of that is mentorship, and this really kind of gets into broadening the actors that may be involved. CIPE works traditionally with economic actors, business associations, businesses and whatnot, and they may not necessarily understand what this issue is like. And so really getting to the heart of the technological and the gender, there are certainly mentorship opportunities among organizations where you can create collaborative initiatives where private sector actors can collaborate with gender organizations to really elevate this and reach those new actors, but then also understand the issue within their own selves. So yeah, I think that's really most of it.
Great, thanks, Adam. And Connie, I'd like to hear your perspective on how TFGBV has been treated as a gender challenge in the past by advocates.
Thank you, Adam, for the question, and also thank you for the opportunity to be here today. It's been really interesting working with the other Adams Center and looking at this intersection of women's economic empowerment and technology. And as Adam mentioned, for us, the conversation, I'd say over this past year that Ipshita has been focusing on this research is first the topic of the access. We know that there's a gender gap when we're looking at the number of women who are online or who have access to different technologies. But there's also this issue of safety. And as people bring their businesses online or using an online platform to run their businesses, that we need to ensure that the conversation also centers on how they're using that platform, and making sure that there's information being shared. So it's not just like the technology information of like, how do I turn the computer on, or how do I, create a website, but it's also, how do you do it in a safe way? So how is data managed? What do you do when there's a hack, or there's, data protection issues? And then also the issue of like online abuse, and how do you respond to that if you're operating in that space? And what actions can you take, or should you take, or do you take? Because what we find a lot of times is that this type of online abuse happens, but then it's not reported, or people don't have the knowledge or information about what they should do about it. Many times when we find women using different online platforms created by big technology companies, there's a responsibility of the user to be the one who's reporting the abuse, or changing privacy settings, or moderating their content. And we can't stop the conversation there. It has to go beyond what the user can or can't do, and bring these different voices into the conversations that are happening, especially as we're focused on the private sector response. In terms of gender specifically, as we know, and one of the things that Ipshita just shared is that just defining what TFGBV is can be a big, complicated first step. And within that is what she also referred to in terms of like the local context, whereas a certain behavior in the US context might not be acceptable, but in another context, it might be viewed as acceptable, even by women, that's just how the culture is, or that's what the norm is for gender in that society. And so that key step of like defining what is technology facilitated gender-based violence and how does it fit within my local cultural context or societal context is really important, because that's where you can start the conversation to then lead to greater changes. So those are some of the things that I would mention. And just to bring in kind of one final idea, I mean, the technology side, as we know, technology means fast changing, right? I mean, the way things were a year ago or 5 years ago, 10 years ago, it's just incredible. And we see more and more now with a shift to AI and the use of artificial intelligence, how that plays in. And there have been some studies that we've looked at in terms of the gendered role or the gendered lens in AI. Also, the use of AI to amplify for good and for bad, things like abuse or computer generated images or computer generated text, things like that. And so it adds another complexity and dimension to this issue of TFGBV. And so that is something that's very new. But it's also something that we're starting to look at and trying to bring that conversation in as everybody's really trying to figure out what AI will mean for how we do business.
Great. Thank you, Connie. Adam, I'd like to hear your perspective on the AI challenge.
Absolutely. And I mean, Connie really said it. I mean, the thing with technology is that, yes, it offers countless opportunities and enables us to really reach all these different markets. But then at the other side of it is really the scale and speed of all of the different threats that can be there. There are a lot of AI, really with the broad accessibility of AI, especially as we think about ChatGPT, these threats are in fact definitely more amplified. We constantly hear about stories about the harassment of chatbots and deepfakes that are really all too real. But then now I'm also learning more about modified versions of OpenAI that really can serve tools to learn how to teach people how to hack, how to write malware and malicious code. And those are all, even scarier threats as we really look at the digital security sort of curtain there. These tools can really make things really more widespread and herald a new wave of cyber attacks and scams and falsehoods, and nothing that's really good there. Also thinking about AI is, social media bots, right? I mean, we talk about the role of the user, but it is also important for the technology companies to really understand how these bots are being programmed and really kind of amplifying the posting of non-consensual sexual material or illicit images, content that can be harassing. And so, these social media bots are really a big issue. And then at the end of the day, it's really leveraging tools that can be an invasion of privacy, such as, the harassment, doxing, cyber stalking, and that it really transfers from the online realm into the physical realm as it even gets scarier. So, yeah.
Great, thanks, Adam. And just a reminder to the audience, please feel free to include any questions in the Q&A. We'll be happy to answer them. Connie and Ipshita, I do have a question for you. I'd like to understand a little bit more about how TFGBV is excluding women from leadership in government and business, or how it's presenting unique challenges toward more inclusive leadership. Connie, we'll start with you.
Sure. Thanks for the question, Adam. So it's interesting that as we CIPE started to look more at the issue of gender-based violence, and also then in the technology facilitated realm or the online realm, we found that there is a lot more resources, toolkits, research, data, looking at women in politics and women journalists, as Ipshita had mentioned as an example. And we didn't find a lot on women in business. And we know that there is some overlap with women in business, women in politics. Many journalists, are business women. But there are some also unique challenges for women in business, whether it's a woman entrepreneur who's running her own business, a company, or whether it's a woman in the workforce, perhaps working for a larger corporation or company. Or leading, CEO level or board of director level. So what we wanted to do is work with our partners around the world to start to really look at this issue, develop resources, and come up with tools that we could share with others, specifically for women in business. And we started one with some surveying to understand what are the unique challenges, specifically looking for women entrepreneurs. So this is more at the micro and small level. As they are operating their businesses online, transitioning their businesses online in the post-COVID world, and also looking at their experiences with online abuse. We did some surveying in Kosovo and Cambodia, Colombia. We've also done some in Philippines. And for an example of some of the main challenges in the Philippines that came through with this surveying is instances of receiving unwanted sexual or offensive content, facing unauthorized account access, other issues of slander, online stalking, identity theft. All of if that's your, operating environment, it's really hard to run your business if you're trying to face all of these challenges, right? And so what we find, what happens is that this leads to several consequences and results. And again, these are things that we've, heard anecdotes. We've seen it in the research and the surveys that we've done. But when business women are faced with these types of operating environments in this online space, it really reduces their business opportunities. We see the silencing and the withdrawal of women, whether they're taking content down, they're really, thinking twice about what they post and what they don't post or what they share in this online space. And a withdrawal from this public participation, whether it's their actual business or whether it's a larger participation in society, because once you have that psychological stress or emotional stress, I mean, that influences how you operate more broadly and more widely outside of just the business realm. We've seen instances where content is removed. Again, thinking about how women have to go through and block users or change their privacy settings to respond to some of the abuse. We have instances where women like limit their business and even close their business because of online attacks. In Kosovo, for example, 20% of those surveyed, the women entrepreneurs that we surveyed, said that they had seen another businesswoman change how she does business online as a result of online harassment and abuse. We see negative impacts on business relationships. In the Philippines, for instance, the women entrepreneurs shared that incidents of workplace and online gender-based violence led to psychological stress, fear for their personal safety, negative impacts on family relationships and business operations, repercussions ranging from reduced opportunities for business to damaged reputations, and even financial losses. So these are widespread and real consequences of an online attack that can really influence how their business is able to operate. And so these are some of the challenges that we've seen in the data that we've collected around the world.
Great. Ipshita, I'd love to hear your perspective on this question.
Yeah, I think Connie did a fantastic job, I think, compiling a lot of those ideas. I just added a couple of things. So just to reiterate, of course, women leaders, politicians, essentially those who are in the public space are particularly at risk of facing this kind of online abuse, harassment, and it has this kind of chilling effect on them. They are more hesitant to share some of their ideas. And of course, if you're especially in politics, journalism, etc., that is a significant barrier to career progression and developing leadership capabilities and going into leadership positions. More specifically about women entrepreneurs, business persons, as well as women workers in the private sector. A few things so this particular research and other work I've done in the past, a few of the things that did come up. So in the context of the society that we are looking at and studying, women taking on these kinds of roles, especially when they are running a business, which is potentially, employing other folks, that is considered already to be kind of a transgression in which they are in some ways challenging gender norms of their society. So that, of course, attracts a certain level of animosity and abuse for women online. Offline, this can really harm their reputation in a social, cultural context. It may harm their family, personal relationships. It may stop them from seeking, again, career development opportunities, which might mean maybe traveling to a particular place or spending more time online or developing more of an online profile. For business women, for entrepreneurs, one of the barriers we also see is in relation to getting funding for their business. And so again, when they are seeking out funding opportunities, that's one of the sort of spaces and one of the times in which they face this kind of harassment, both online and offline. And there it could also come up from a lack of trust, a lack of again, that kind of challenge to the established gender norms of the society, and facing more difficulties in being able to access funding relates quite directly to their inability to pursue a lot of these activities and be in some of these leadership roles. So yeah, I think some of those really end up impacting women's choices in, again, offline as well, in terms of what types of careers they seek, how they choose to pursue them, and the extent to which they are able to push some of those gender norms in the face of this kind of harassment.
Thanks, Ipshita. Adam, I'd like to hear your perspective as well.
Thanks, Adam. And I mean, I think definitely agree with everything that's been said. But one also aspect to really kind of be looking at too is gig work and freelance workers. We recently did some work in the Philippines as well, where they did look at the role of freelance workers and the experiences that they have undergone. And certainly there are plenty of opportunities to really help and ensure that there's economic opportunity. But then the regulatory protections are extremely undeveloped. There are issues of scammers or not paying the employee per se, and really at the end of the day too, with these freelance workers, their information is public on these job market sites, which can also leave them susceptible to phishing attempts, non-payment for work, and then other forms of economic coercion. And so I think looking at the gig work is definitely an important perspective, especially as we're looking at the role of technology.
Great, thank you, Adam. So before moving into the questions from the audience, the final question for Adam and Ipshita. So to both of you, we talked quite a bit about how emerging technologies are creating new opportunities for TFGBV. But what are some examples where new technologies are helping to mitigate TFGBV? Adam, we'll start with you.
Thanks. Yeah, I mean, I think really the good thing about technology is that it can still be used for good. We just really know how to wield it better. We saw a lot of good examples in the case studies that Ipshita had shared, addressing the knowledge gap and supporting the information flows, and with delete nothing. I also will like to highlight another website that I like to go to is the OECD AI Monitor. It tracks incidents related to AI more in general, but really kind of understanding how those sorts of risks are playing out. And really tech and AI can also be used to support policy development. We talked about ChatGPT a little bit and leveraging the knowledge, not necessarily just saying, oh, I'm going to take exactly what ChatGPT puts out, but really thinking through, okay, what sort of policy strategies or advocacy initiatives might I be able to build? How might I build coalitions? You could all put this sort of information in there and really kind of get a menu of options, and then identifying, okay, what might work best for your own local context. Along these lines too, CDEG supports these in-person trainings, as I mentioned, and e-learning. Is certainly important to really reach those sorts of broader masses. Digital literacy training, it's not really just for the sake of getting people online. And as Connie had reiterated too, we really need to help ensure that there's a digital security lens and really help people understand how treacherous the online environment can be, but then also help equip them with the tools to really combat that. But ultimately, it's technology is really in the digital space. All of that really has to play out into the physical space. Technology is not always the solution. It can serve as that tool to really make the connections, but the real action is in the real world. And a lot of those case studies demonstrated that, especially in TEDx or Olympia's Law, where the movement really was initiated online, but then that action translated into that physical space. So that I would say, as much as technology offers a lot of opportunities, use it, but figure out how you can translate that into real world action.
Great, thank you, Ipshita.
Yeah, I think that's an important question. And yeah, as you're saying, it creates all these opportunities for predatory behaviors. Something that I think when there are solutions that emerge from the digital space, in some ways, it might be an easier first step for a lot of women to take rather than walking into a police station or seeking a legal redressal in that sense. So a survey tool like Delete Nothing, for example, to be able to tell your story in your own words and have control over that information rather than it getting immediately taken in this direction that you may not fully be able to control. I think that's that can feel empowering to a lot of survivors of TFGBV. Two other examples that come to mind. So these were not cases we studied, but there are examples studied in this research. But there are examples, for example, for instance, stop NCII, there's this image hashing technique that's used to essentially generate. So if there is a non-consensual intimate image that has been leaked, you can create an image hash for that and sort of use that to remove all instances of that being spread across different social media platforms. So there's also other types of AI bots, for example, using large language models. There's some that are in development currently. There was one that, Adam, we spoke about that quite right at the beginning of this research coming out of Nepal. That's one of the reasons we didn't study it is because it was really in early stages, but it is trying to, again, detect intimate partner violence and sort of abuse that's taking place both on, particularly through text messages, online, social media, and so on, detecting it and removing it. But I do agree with what Adam said as well in terms of these are preliminary steps, and a lot of the impacts are definitely more sort of the hostile impacts can definitely take place offline as well, including physical impacts. Women who have been attacked as being, kind of having that they have something that they're being attacked as being promiscuous or sexually promiscuous or so on and so forth, are much more at risk of them facing those types of attacks offline and physically. And so that's something that translation between the online and the offline definitely is really important. But there are these emerging technologies which are hopeful also in terms of helping women take that first step.
Great, thank you, Ipshita. So I'd like to move on to the questions from the audience now. First question for you, Ipshita. One of the key findings related to the lack of data, could you please elaborate on the types of data that we would need to collect moving forward? Go into a bit more detail about what future efforts at data collection could look like.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some of those could relate to just, for example, the types of behaviors that are enabled by these technologies, simply because so many of these technologies are still in development. We were just talking about the potential of AI, deepfakes, and so on. And so, yes, I think understanding the type of data used in a particular context. It could be an economic business platform. It could be more of a social media kind of space. Understanding how this data also relates to that particular culture. I think there are certain types of behaviors that might be more common in particular cultures. And as we kind of talked about already, there are certain types of behaviors that we may consider problematic, but are more acceptable, are considered more normalized in certain other contexts. So I think all those types of data, they matter. And another sort of type of data that would be interesting to collect is how do companies and particularly social media platforms react? How quickly do they respond? What is the process? How do these images or this kind of objectionable content get taken down? Understanding that process will also be important.
Great, thank you. Now a question for all three of you. Could you share some examples of private sector leadership, best practices to implement the solutions explored in the research? Ways that businesses or business associations or chambers of commerce could lead the way in implementing these solutions. And we'll start with Connie.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. It's been interesting because in several instances, we've had partners come to us with interest in support for some type of online training that includes different topics like marketing, communications, how to develop a business plan, how do you take your business online, things like that. And we've been the ones saying, okay, but what about the safety and security aspect of it? What are you doing about, what are you going to train and talk about in terms of like online abuse or things that can happen in the online space as you're teaching these digital or technological skills? And so I mentioned that as an example of some instances, people aren't thinking about this topic and how it relates to some other project that they'd like to implement. And we've been the ones to raise the issue. And I think that's one of the things that we've done as a concrete example with the private sector is raising the issue. And once the issue is raised, we've found it like opens a floodgate of like, oh yeah, let me tell you about all these experiences that I've had as a person, you know. And so it's creating that space for dialogue. Again, this topic can be very taboo in cultures. It can be very sensitive. You're talking about instances of you know, great trauma and stress that have occurred to people. And so creating safe spaces to have conversations, keeping it within the viewpoint of the private sector. What can a company do? What can a business association do for its members to help them talk about these topics, to respond to these topics, to become part of a larger conversation, like building coalitions of, okay, what's going on? You know, there's a lot of new legislation coming out of the EU. So for EU nations, you know, how are they responding to that? What changes need to occur in order to be compliant? And, you know, even at like the firm level, thinking about, okay, what can a company do to create or amend policies that already exist so that we're just including the online space? So they might have anti-discrimination or anti-harassment policies, but does that include online calls? Does it include, you know, technologies that are instances of conversations happening on a, you know, a company cell phone? You know, like, so thinking about how companies can amend their current policies or create new ones to address those new challenges that are coming along. What actions will be taking? How can an employee you know, respond or file a complaint? What type of investigation occurs? Things like that. And those are things like copies of policies or templates that can be used. Those are things that business associations can help their members by providing those types of tools. You know, some of the other things that we've seen our partners do is media campaigns, like the one that Ipshita mentioned, providing training, providing resources, spaces to talk about this, creating those safe spaces for women or people of other gender minorities, in creating these spaces where it's safe to talk about what happened or safe to talk about these topics in general. Looking at sharing information. So what government protocols exist? What laws exist? So it's that awareness raising that can happen. We've also seen examples of advocating for laws, of making these definitions of TFGBV formalized by law, looking at how law enforcement responds, the service delivery for people who have been in situations of TFGBV. So we have examples of that with our partners around the world. And then looking at how we can support research to, you know, again, create content, create data, raise awareness of what's the situation for specific groups. And so as Ipshita has mentioned, it's not like a generalized thing that it affects all people in all sectors of society the same way. It's very targeted, it's very particular. And so understanding what those experiences are like, because it's very important for the private sector to then bring that voice to the conversation. And one of the main things I think that companies and business associations, private sector in general, can do is help governments understand, what does this look like in our space? What does this look like in our industry or our sector? And then that will help you know, produce a better result that's really targeted to that the particular situations. So they can bring that perspective to these conversations that are happening more and more between government, civil society, and private sector actors.
Great, thank you. Adam, we'll go to you next.
Yeah, I mean, Connie was really quite comprehensive, so there isn't much more to add there. But I think one thing I will say is really a willingness to learn and to collaborate. I mean, as we approach these sorts of, business associations or entrepreneurs or groups, they very similar. We don't have an issue. We don't know what this is about. But then as we talk a lot about educate a little bit more, then they'll come around and be like, oh, okay, let's learn more. How does this impact us? How can we engage on this topic? And I think really it's at the big end of the day, it's that willingness to learn and collaborate. So yeah.
Great, thank you. Ipshita.
Yeah, I'll just add a couple of things. One is that working with business associations, one challenge that we might run across is that they might not consider this to be really part of their work. They might consider this to be a social topic that's really unrelated to what they do. So or really trying to frame it in a way that suggests what are going to be the economic costs of not dealing with it, of not mainstreaming it, and again, like using this as a forum to talk about some of the tech tools, to talk about some of the best practices, for instance, around developing workplace policies or confidential platforms. Really selling that and the significance of that would be key. And using strategies like leveraging CSR or ESG in terms of highlighting what can be done and how this has beneficial effects for the business, for the chamber as a whole. I think those are also important steps.
Great, thank you. We're nearly at time, so I'll ask one or two questions, time dependent. So a question for all three of you again. How do you ensure that women-only spaces, one of the proposed solutions in the research, are safe for people of all diversities? So how do you, I guess, guarantee that the spaces are inclusive and safe? And we'll start with Ipshita.
I think that's a really great question. It really falls to the organization to be able to, again, depending on where they are located, where they are at, they're navigating a set of political, social, cultural contexts that are unique. I saw there was another question in the chat about how in certain places, the environment is absolutely hostile towards gender or sexual minorities. So how do you work in a context like that? I think, so one is that, yes, there are those all women spaces that can be a part of the organization or the firm, and they are navigating this set of circumstances, and we need to push them to be as inclusive as possible. But it's also important to understand that because we have this digital option available, there can be spaces like this that are created where we are able to talk about those diverse factors more openly and talk about questions around what TFGBV looks like, targeted at particular groups more openly. And that's, again, maybe linking to the previous question, the role of a business association or a chamber of commerce, or even a transnational group like we saw in the case of TDIC. Those can really play an important role here.
Thank you. Connie.
Yeah, I mean, there's not an easy answer. One thing that I would add in terms of considering, how do we bring change, right? How do we make change for these types of conversations? And it is very important to consider the local context and also finding spaces that have already been developed that can take this topic and add it to their repertoire of, topics that they engage on. And finding those organizations, those leaders, including men, who are willing to stand up and bring these topics to the table, look for solutions, give examples, be part of the conversations and part of the change that we'd like to see happen. And in some places it's easier than others. As Ipshita is saying, the online space, one of the benefits is that you can make those bridges and those connections across borders sometimes more easily. And so it can give a hope, and it can give, you can build trust and build communities that are in these online spaces. You can share examples. People can learn from each other and the experiences that they've had in other countries, and thinking about, would that work here? Could I do something similar here? You know, like an Olympia's Law, and that type of scenario, you know, could that lead to something here in my country? And so finding those spaces, and when you're talking about, you know, creating these online spaces, yeah, a lot of it is about building trust, and sometimes that just takes time, and it's up to the companies to ensure that the spaces that they are creating are really safe, and showing that leadership of, if something were to happen, having a response that's appropriate so that people know that they're being very serious about it.
Great, thank you. Adam, we're nearly at time, so I'll give you the last word.
Thanks. Yeah, and I'll be brief and really just want to underscore trust. I mean, trust is extremely important as we look at, you know, digital security, but then also kind of creating these sorts of platforms. And so it does take a long time and trying to identify who or where to go. But at the end of the day, those are the sorts of places that are really the most impactful. I'll also note too, I mean, as Connie and Ipshita were mentioning, broadening the base, looking at who those male allies can be is also quite important. So you can really kind of work in certain environments where, you know, again, referring to that other question that related to Uganda, you know, where some of those more challenging environments might not really be accustomed, but you're able to kind of know who can really help you throughout that process.
Great, thank you, Adam. So these are all the questions that we have time for today. So I want to thank everyone very much for their participation, to the panelists and also the audience. Please keep an eye out for additional policy solutions, releases and events, as well as the post-event survey. Thanks very much, everyone. Have a good day.